We're going to look at 27, 28, and 29 today of Paradise. Three cantos that really, I think, Dante constructs together, and where Dante puts forth this theory of creation and cosmology, two which are not quite the same thing. A theory of Beatrice that's explaining the shape of the cosmos. It's very difficult, three cantos. But it's done in such a way that there are two different things, it would seem: creation and a physical description of the cosmos, which we call cosmology. And they are, because Dante is dealing with two forms of the universe, a spiritual one and the physical one. Now, I'm going to show all of this as we go over the three cantos. But I would like to argue that, in effect, they are not quite the same thing, but not really all that distinct. There's a very tenuous line separating the two of them. Well, where are we, first of all, in space? We are somewhere in space. Dante has gone past now the heaven of the fixed stars with the examination of the three words, the three terms, the foundations of things that we experience as trust, or we experience as existential hope, or a love that, if you combine it, implies always, not in Canto 26, but in possibilities of betrayal, uncertainty. So it combines both faith and hope in a very problematical way. But Canto 27, Dante continues with in the afterglow of the fixed stars. And the canto, just to give you an idea about what formally is happening here, the first part of the canto really looks back formally at Canto 27 of Inferno. There is clearly a parallel between the two cantos. Here Dante, you remember what he does. He meets St. Peter, actually, who has been examining him, but now, after the examination of the three theological virtues, he goes on in a prophetic denunciation. He denounces the collusion between his place, he says, my place, it's the papacy, the place instituted because of him, he's the Peter, he's the stone, and his successors. That's the way it starts. So the canto literally looks backwards. And the parallel with, you have a number of parallels with Inferno 19, where Dante meets, you remember the popes who are turned upside down, and the flames, the parody of the Pentecostal fires are on the plants of their feet. But this is more clearly a reference to Canto 27 of Inferno, where this is the very beginning. This is there is a hymn, Canto 27, glory be to the Father, the Son, etc. And then lines 40 and following, we have this great attack. It was not our meaning, 45, that on the right hand of our successors should sit one part of Christ's people and on the other on the left. Not that the keys which were committed to me should become the device on a standard for warfare on the baptized. Nor that I should be the figure on a seal for sold and lying favors, for which I often redden and flash with fire. This is the fire of prophecy, without a doubt, but it's also retrospectively a reference to the attack against Boniface, who in Canto 27 of Inferno is shown as he is in colluding with the Guido da Montefeltro. You remember? So there is a clear, it's a clear symmetry between the two cantos. I will hasten to add that Canto 27 also has a kind of chiastic structure, because at one point, just to give you, this is a formal description of what's happening here. A little later, after this outburst by Peter, Beatrice and the pilgrim move on to the next heaven, which is around line 75 and following. The next heaven is the so-called crystalline heaven, which is still material. He's at the boundary of the material universe. It's still material, but it's very exactly crystal-like. It's a very thin materiality, almost but not quite spiritual. It's also called the primum mobile, because it's here, this is the technical term that they give, it's here that in this heaven that we have problems of origins, the origin of time, the origin of space. Dante goes on giving this, Beatrice goes on giving this cosmological description of the universe in material terms. And here, to continue with the formal, the question, the issue of form now, at one point Beatrice says, wait, look behind you so that you can have an idea, you can measure the enormous distance you have traveled from the earth. He's at the boundary of the material cosmos. And you might say, well, he's at the edge of the cosmos, he's going to fall off. That was always one of the objections about the idea of the finiteness of the cosmos. Believe it or not, in the 17th century, it would never really fall off because the universe is a sphere. So the only place he has to go to is back. There's no literally edge. Every point is the edge, and every point is in a continuous spherical curve. But anyway, from the point of view, he's arriving there. So she says, look back. And what does he see? And this is the line. From the time when I had, listen, this is 27, line 75. From the time when I had looked before, I saw that I had moved through the whole arc. That's the language of the sphere, an arc, circle, an arc. Just gives you an idea of sphericity. From the middle to the end of the first climb. So that I saw, on the one hand, beyond Cadiz, the mad track of Ulysses. He pinpoints that little place where Ulysses trespassed the boundaries of the world, of the Euclidean space he had, for which he has been damned in Canto 26 of Inferno. So you see, this is what we call a chiasmus. In other words, 26 and 27, we do see that 26 that are allusion to Ulysses and Adam, right? We talked about these figures, and here in 27 and in 27 of hell there is Boniface, and then in Paradise 27 there is this, and there is also a kind of this is Ulysses. So there's a sort of chiastic structure. 27 of Paradise refers to 26 of Paradise, and refers also to 27 of Inferno and 26 of Inferno. So, and the question is, why does Dante pinpoint once again Ulysses? He sees at the west the point which Ulysses had trespassed, and he calls it the mad track of Ulysses. Clearly a counter. Ulysses is still part of this fascination that it exerts an incredible fascination on the imagination of the poet and the pilgrim. Am I like Ulysses, or am I going to be lost now like Ulysses? But at the same time, it's a way of hinting at how much he has exceeded Ulysses' adventure. Ulysses only went past the pillars of Hercules. He, Dante, is now at the outermost boundary of the visible physical universe. So there's a way in which there is a little bit of a detachment and yet a constant fascination. We try to explain why he's so fascinated with Ulysses. At the other end, he also sees, and on the other, nearly to the shore where Europa made herself a sweet burden. This is really the eastern part of the known world, Europe, the rape of Europe by Jupiter, so that we really have an erotic transgression and an intellectual transgression, as if the two now once again are involved in this in Dante's vision, as if he's now coming to the point where knowledge and desire really have to coincide. He's come to the point where the beautiful and the good are one, at the point where all of the great contraries and distinctions that we have been pursuing all along nearly have to go on converging. Let me continue with this idea. This is before I go on with what happens in the Canto. The Canto, Dante then moves into the primum mobile, which is the place where I continue with this. He goes on line 100. They go into the swiftest part of heaven. That's the primum mobile. All motion begins from here. Dante is moving from what would seem to be the ethical scene, this denunciation, Peter's denunciation of the abuses within the church. That's done in a prophetic tone, but also from a tone of the ethical language. He goes into the so-called primum mobile, which actually is the heaven of metaphysics. I've been telling you about the grammar, rhetoric, music, geometry. This is what we call the heaven of metaphysics. And you know what that is, right? You understand what metaphysics means. It's Dante refers to it as they did refer to it. Aristotle refers to it as the first philosophy. And they called it first because it rules supreme among all the arts and all the sciences. It's the most important of the sciences. It's the point of arrival of all the sciences. And it's called first philosophy because it explains also questions of origins, and you see the language of origins here, the origin of time, the origin of space, creation itself, the beginning of the world, causes, foundations. This is the great realm that metaphysics discusses. Dante, the interesting thing is that in the Middle Ages, and Dante has to connect it with physics. Physics, he says, and metaphysics really go hand in hand. One tries to give the explanation of the physical world, and metaphysics, the theoretical general rules. In fact, and this is probably, I should mention this, there are people who believe that metaphysics was not a term that really indicated anything really different, completely different from the knowledge that physics provides. They would say that was metaphysics was called metaphysics because the book was placed on the shelf a little bit after the book on physics. You see what I mean? It was really more a way of defining the place of the book on the library, so to speak. It's probably, but it was known as that, but it's probably more of a fiction than anything else. The fact is that there is such a science for Dante that deals with causes, origins, beginnings, time, etc. One of the things that here we have, it's that Dante's that Beatrice starts describing, line 100, the nature of the universe. Here she plays the cosmologist, which holds the center still and moves all else around it, begins here. So this is already the beginning. It's literally the language of beginnings. Here begins motion. Dante stands then at the boundary of the physical universe, and now she gives an explanation of this. He's at the boundary. And this heaven has no other place, question of, but the divine mind. The real beginning, the real universe is in God's mind. Okay? So he distinguishes two worlds, the physical world we see and the spiritual world which is in God's mind. In a way, and just to make it very simple, Dante is journeying into the mind of God. There is one man who had written a text, Bonaventure, whom you have met before, and he wrote this book called The Itinerary of the Mind into God. This is the way of trying to explore, to enter, mystically enter the mind of God. Dante doesn't do it in a mystical way. He tries to understand what's beyond the physical world. To give the description of this universe, this is the term that keeps reappearing in the next three cantos. Light and love enclose it in a circle, as it does the others. And of the girding, he that girds is the sole intelligence. This primum mobile, it really is a kind of curve that wraps up all the other heavens. We have seen this is the ninth heaven. All the other heavens have been are enwrapped within it. But it's not only a boundary. Dante views it as also the beginning, the threshold for the spiritual universe. Okay, it's both the boundary of the physical world, and it's always also the, so it goes like this. This is the earth, and goes growing, etc. And then when we come to the ninth, this becomes at the same time a kind of convex and concave semicircle. I have, believe it or not, a shape of what I think is Dante's cosmos. And here it is. This is, I'm going to pass it around. This is a shell, but it's actually really made. It's incredible and found. This would be pass it around here and I explain. There are spirals, really like, since Dante thinks of the cosmos as a book, and we would call it a cosmo book. That's if that's a neologism that I coin here now, a kind of cosmo book, the book in the shape of a cosmos. It's really a parchment, rolled up within itself. You know what parchments are in medieval and classical ideas of the production, the material production of books. We have the ancient parchments, which are all rolled up, like the term is around a stick and then held together by a ring. That's really the shape. It's a sort of a production of books that in the history of the book is later replaced around the 4th century AD by the so-called codex, which we have, for instance, even in Beinecke. A codex has, it's made of quartos, it's made of folios, and divided like a book today, made of, would have quartos, folios. If you go and see the Shakespeare's, the folios of Shakespeare in the Elizabethan club, for instance, if they let you go in or you belong there, take a look and see what the codex really is. Dante seems to be combining the two forms. But anyway, you have an idea here of what the shape that I'm trying to describe to you is. There are a kind of, if you wish, there are spirals, one following the other, and next to it there is going to be a spiritual universe, another universe, which we'll come to in a moment. So this is the first description that she's giving. The idea of the sphericity of space, that's one thing. The space is spherical, and has the primum mobile as a boundary. And now we have, and Beatrice goes on explaining, its motion is not determined by others, this is line 112, but from it the rest have their measures. Everything begins here. This is the physical beginning of the universe which we inhabit, even as 10 from half and the fifth. In other words, it's as sure as it is that 2 plus 5 make 10. And how time should have its roots in that vessel and in the others, its leaves, may not be plain to thee. Even time begins here. Time is understood then by Dante. Do you see what as a kind of a tree growing from a pot, the pot of eternity. He does not understand time in a linear way, that has a beginning and then ends. It's not the wheel of time, or the wheel of becoming. You may have heard this. Have you heard this description about the wheel of becoming, in which this is a Platonic idea of time, where all things are contained? Dante thinks of a tree, of time as a tree, the roots of which are in the pot of eternity, and the foliages are reach into our own world. We are in the shadow of the tree of time. We only see leaves that will fall, because this idea of the dispersion and the falling of time, the passing of time. So this is the definition of what happens in 27. So she continues after a while with this about, once again, the language of covetousness and moral language about the what happens in the world, and we move on to Canto 28. Just tell you, I have not forgotten that we are talking about Ulysses in a little while, and so it continues with 28 deals with the angelic hierarchy. We are now still in the primum mobile, but Dante starts seeing into the other universe, the spiritual universe. And he sees a universe which is adjacent to the physical universe, inhabited by angels. And so that the corresponding part, you have the 9 planets, the 7 planets plus the fixed stars and the crystalline heaven, and now you have the 9 orders of angels. And Beatrice will go on describing the 3 triads of angels: angels, archangels, thrones. This is the language that comes from the Bible. The Old Testament comes from Babylonian, apparently, and Persian sources, apocalyptic sources, and would not seem to be really terribly different from that tradition. And here we have also another where this whole description of the angelic order continues. And when I turned, line 12, let me just focus on this a bit. And when I turned again, and mine were met by what appears in that revolving sphere, to one that looks intently on its circling, I saw a point, distant, so we are at the boundary of the universe. Another universe emerges into view, and Dante only sees a point which radiated a light so keen that the eye on which it burns must close for its piercing power. So once again, a series of revolving spheres. No, this universe is not the projection of the other universe. They are separate and adjacent. They are 2 hemispheres. And this is what happens in Canto 28. And we go to Canto 29. And I ask you to see how the whole argument continues. Beatrice has been explaining breathlessly the whole question of angelic hierarchy. And by the end of Canto 28, he sees, she even mentions that the order, actually it's Dante here who mentions that the order, his ordering of angels, the hierarchy, is very different from the one of the pseudo-Dionysius, line 130. He says, these orders all gaze above and so prevail below, that all are drawn and all draw to God. And Dionysius set himself with such zeal to contemplate, this is the pseudo-Dionysius, who had written about the angelic hierarchy. And Dante goes on to say that he differs from him, that he just, his idea of angels is a little different from his and Pope Gregory's, a statement of his own intellectual independence, both in terms of a theologian and in terms of an ecclesiastical authority. And then Beatrice finishes the description of this hierarchy, meaning the sacred order. That's what the Greek word means, the sacred order of angelic the intelligences. Their function is to impart motion to the spheres. Their function is to move between the divinity and human beings. They are the messengers. They keep their spiritual entities, and they keep moving between God and human beings. And then we go into Canto 29, where now the language of cosmology, about the order of the cosmos, becomes creation. And I want to show this to you. However, this shift to the language of creation is conducted in an extraordinarily interesting way. Dante wants to say that Beatrice has been talking non-stop about, with probably even a touch of playfulness, about the angelic orders. And then she moves, almost like without catching her breath, talking about creation. Canto 29. But look how this shift from the order of angels to the order of creation is described. This is the beginning of Canto 29. When the 2 children of Latona, covered by the ram and by the scales, both at once make a belt of the horizon, as long as from the moment when the zenith holds them balanced, till the one and the other changing hemisphere are unbalanced from that girdle for so long, her face illumined with a smile, Beatrice kept silence, looking fixedly at the point that had overcome me. What an extraordinary image. Let's read it again so we make sure that we understand it, because I'm not sure that it's very clear, though I think it's I can make it clear. But let's look at this again. When the two children of Latona, meaning the sun and the moon, that's really what he's saying. He has to describe the fact that Beatrice seems not to have kept quiet, that she went endlessly from one thing to another. That's what I call the playfulness of Dante's thinking. And he's saying that this is the image that he uses, is when the two children of Latona, Apollo and Diana, you know that, the sun and the moon, we're in the universe of, though Dante is using mythical language. Look at the language, first of all. The two children of Latona, myth, covered by the ram and the scales, science. Both at once make a belt of the horizon, an Arabic word meaning the boundary of the heavens, so science, scientific language. As long as from that moment when the zenith, scientific language, the mixture and balancing of science and myth, but also a way of talking about a balance that is as vanishing and as fleeting as it could ever be. That's the point, that there was silence, but he could almost not even tell that there was a break in Beatrice's speech. This is what he's saying. When the two children of Latona, the sun, or Apollo, and the moon, or Diana, along the horizon, they seem to be aligned together, and they're held together by the zenith. This is the zenith, the highest point, as opposed to the nadir, right? So this is the balance that he's describing. They're kept in a balance, in a rare equilibrium, when they seem to be aligned together, and that balance and equilibrium is quickly disappearing. What is he saying? He's saying that she almost didn't stop speaking, and then she began. Then she goes on with the theory of creation. I tell, not ask what you would hear, for I have seen it there where every ubi and every quando is center. Place, I have seen at a point where place, space, and time coincide. Not to gain any good for himself, which cannot be, but that his splendor, shining back, might say, I stand, subsisto, in his eternity, beyond time, beyond every other bound, as it pleased him, the eternal love revealed himself in new loves. I have to correct my good friend, dear old friend St. Clair, because actually Dante does not say that. He says that love, the eternal love, actually the language he uses, I don't know, I hope your other translations, those who use other translations are luckier, opened itself in new loves, opened itself. I take this to be as sexual a language as it can be found. The new love engendered, opened itself into new loves. And then in fact it continues, not before did he lies it were inert, for until God's moving upon the waters, there was not before or after. Before God's creation, the language is biblical, from Genesis, there was no before nor after. In the physics, this is an allusion to Aristotle's physics. Where Aristotle has to define time, he says it's the measure, we speak of time when there is a before and an after. Because this is really what time is, the measure of motion in regard to a before and an after. Dante says that before this time of creation, there was no such a thing. It cannot be distinguished before in terms of time. There was no such a thing as before and after. And then he goes on just to continue with his sexual metaphor. Form and matter, united and separate, came into being that had no defect, like three arrows from a three-string bow. The question of creation as a coming together of form and matter is here described as a conjunction, since the language of creation takes place as an act of love. That's the first thing Beatrice is saying. And creation comes through as passion. a love passion. It's an opening up in love, opening up in new loves. And it's as physical, the language of creation, as it could ever be. It's as in terms of the natural, the language of natural production and reproduction. This is the context of what she's saying, before and after. It is as if to have a creation is that which introduces the possibility of distinguishing between a before and an after, introduces a difference. That's what the language of Beatrice is. Let me go back to the image with which we started. Dante is wondering whether or not there was any break in Beatrice's speech. And he says that if there was a break, it was so fleeting, as happens with whenever the sun and the moon along the line of the horizon are aligned together, and it is as if they are balanced and held together by the zenith above. And that is such a fleeting moment in the alignment of the stars. Why this metaphor? Not only he's saying that, but I think there is also an allusion to Francesca here in Canto 5. Did you catch it? Where he says, for so long, her face illumined with a smile, Beatrice kept silence. She just kept on talking, looking fixedly at the point that had overcome me. The point that had overcome me is clearly an allusion to, but only a point was that overcame us, Francesca says in Canto 5. Okay? That's all. So there's an allusion to Francesca. The question that I have to answer, that I raised with you, is why is Dante mentioning these two infernal figures and framing his discussion on cosmology creation, first of all by talking about Ulysses, and now talking about, or alluding to, not even mentioning, but alluding to Francesca. Why these two? One who wants to transgress and trespass the boundaries of the world in order to know, the other one who transgresses the norms of what is allowed because of love. Knowledge and love somehow come into play. But they're in the infernal version. What is he saying, though, with this image? Why this talked about Francesca, the sun and the moon aligned briefly? What do you think he's saying? It's not a rhetorical question. Let me just, why do you think he would use this kind of language? Immediately after, Beatrice goes on explaining the creation of the world and the distinction between a before and an after. Why this metaphor? Why this long paragraph, this image here? Anybody? I think that Dante is asking, right here, is it possible to localize a break? And he's saying it is as when we speak, that thing seems to be continuous, and yet just as in every syllable, between a sound and another, there is always an interval. So there was in the language of Beatrice. And that's what, to him, is the idea of creation. It seems to be, the opposite of creation would be the eternity of the world, something which would be, the universe is eternal. It has no beginning and no identifiable break. How can you tell? So if the universe is eternal, you have no differences inside it. Dante wants to say it seems to be a continuous, the universe seems to have a continuous extension. Without time, a kind of eternity. It goes on, and yet it says when we speak that you can identify the break. There was, however minute, there was a break between Beatrice's exposition about the angelic orders and now the exposition that she goes into about creation. And why then the other two metaphors? Now it's time to answer the question. Why talking through Ulysses and Francesca? Why evoke those two images? I wish we could, I have to keep that hanging a while so it can become a little bit more compelling, what I'm going to tell you. So with it, order. Now this is And as a ray shines, this Beatrice is continuing with form and matter, united and separate. This is conjoined and pure and conjoined, he says. And as a ray shines into glass or amber or crystal, so that from it coming to its completeness there is no interval, so that a threefold creation flashed into being from its Lord all at once without distinction in its beginning. With it, all that was created and ordained for the spirits, and these were the summit of the universe, in whom was produced pure act, pure potency, and so on. So the idea is that there is a universe of creation, the universe of creation, which seems to be very much like the physical world. It's described in physical terms, the terms of the moon and sexuality, the cosmological language in scientific terms, and yet there is some kind of difference that is introduced. Without creation, we would not have difference, we would not even have origins. That's the language. Now, why those two figures? Why Ulysses and Francesca? Ulysses, I think that what Dante is doing finally is allowing us to see what the world of Inferno has to be seen as. The world of Inferno that we only saw as a world rejected, as a world of evil and horror, all of a sudden is now retrieved as the best exemplar of what we may come to know of the spiritual world. It is almost an imaginative redemption that Dante goes into about the actual idea of hell. He's implying, and that could become in many ways heretical, but I hope to show you that it is not, that the universe, as it goes back, as one goes back to the beginnings, clearly the journey to the beginnings has to be seen as a redemption of all that has been falling away. Let me just say it in a slightly less tortuous way. There can be no redemption unless it implies that the whole of evil is overcome and destroyed. So that even the world of hell now appears all of a sudden as part of what we get to know about the ultimate structure of the universe. This seems to me to be the real lesson, the underlying and powerful message that Dante is sending through these three cantos in the heaven of metaphysics. Let me stop here before I move into the next canto, Canto 30, and see if there are, let me take the questions now before we go on to the next canto. I could go back maybe and try to redo what I have been saying, because it's, but let me see if I have some questions, and then we can do that. Please.
Are you suggesting that he is claiming that the entire world creation is redeemable, including those who are in the eternity?
He never says that. Let me be very, very clear. He never says it anywhere. There is never an indication thematically. There is everything else that I have said, I could find counterparts in a thematic, thematized in the sense that it becomes part of a conscious articulation on the part of, he knows, and he thematizes, he makes it a theme, clear. Never says that. But there are two implications, though, that I'm drawing on in order to be able to make that kind of statement. The first is the very idea of the cosmos as a sphere, right? And the idea of the cosmos as a sphere, it really means that wherever you are going, and you are going toward God, then you are going back to the beginning. Everything else can go back to the beginning, because that's the form, the shape of the cosmos. I'm drawing out the implication about this understanding of the universe. The other reason is that there is such a thing as a redemption. And Dante's, we didn't read the canto, Canto 7 of Paradise is focused on redemption, a new beginning. That's what redemption means. Redemption means that the cosmos can go back to its beginning and be restored in its original form. If this is true, it could very well be that, from the point of view of the poem, Lucifer is always going to be stuck in his ice forever. There's no hint that he can move even. Francesca is always moving around in vicious circles, right? Remembering and lost in the labyrinth of time. To her, she literally moves in time. Memory, I cannot think about the past without being moved by it, and goes back constantly around it. Ulysses gets lost who knows where. There is no where for him. He has no sense of a place. Even from this point of view, I can go on understanding that in a Canto where place matters, Ulysses never had a sense of belonging anywhere. That's the utter dislocation. A kind of, he doesn't have a family that holds him back, the children, the kingdom, Ithaca, anything. He just goes on moving. That is the overt sense of the poem. But there is this theology of redemption. And I'm wondering whether theology of redemption does not entail necessarily that there is a return to the beginning. But before I go on, though, with restating some of this, I want to ask you to, because I think it's one of a technique that Dante uses, which is really extraordinary. Can you go to the beginning of Canto, the famous image of Latona, when the two children of Latona, beginning of Canto 29. I really would like to ask you to look at the Italian a little bit. I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to read. I'm going to ask you to look. I won't read it though. At the first word, quando, right? You want to see that? And look at line, that's really the poem, what we call rhetorically the prothesis of the canto, the beginning of the canto, the introduction of the canto. Go to line 12, the last word, quando, right? Go to the first, back to the first line, the last word in that line, latona. This is the latona, okay? The first two letters, la. Go back to canto, to line 12, I'm sorry, the first two letters, la. Draw this, that's a chiasmus. Draw the lines together, and they will meet exactly at the word hemisphere, hemisphero, that's the center. That's the hemisphere. Hemisphere means that it's half. The Greek is the two half spheres. The universe is two half spheres composing one. I think Dante's placing us at a cosmic crossroads. He's locating us. He's telling us where we are, first of all, okay? But he's also telling us that this universe has a kind of very occult and very secret laws that the poem has these secret laws that regulate it. I'm really arguing then that there is this subtext that is, if a radical redemptive theology would only entail the absolute purification of evil, so that the universe will have to really go back to this kind of Pythagorean purity, but without the phases and descents. You know you know what I mean, all of you. This Pythagorean idea that the life of the universe stretches for 360,000 years. Did you ever hear about that? 360,000 years, which are really like the days of the year. You know, the 365. I think we have 360,000. Years, every 360,000 years, the universe rotates and goes back to its point of origin. And then decadence starts again, the age of gold, the age of silver, the age of iron, the age of paper, we would call it now, etc. It goes back and then it goes back to its origin. That's not the way Dante understands the movement of the cosmos, but he does understand he does present this redemptive event that makes the universe return to its pristine purity. That's why I made that statement. Any other points before I go back? Because I really think I should say all of what I said before. Any other questions can help me clarify these various points? I can help. Yes.
Wait, sorry. What is the redemptive event?
I'm sorry.
What is the redemptive event?
The Incarnation.
The incarnation.
The Incarnation is the redemptive event that means. What is the redemptive event? The Incarnation. That I call it redemptive event that would make a new creation, a new Adam has come into the world, and that new Adam, through the sacrifice, his sacrifice, through the gift. God allowed the Incarnation because human beings on their own would not be capable. That's the theology of redemption. Human beings on their own would not be able to save and redeem themselves, so that an intervention from God through his Son was made inevitable in order to reconstruct and in order to bring out and produce that original order of the cosmos. And if that is true, and it is true, and you only have to look at everywhere in the poem, but Canto 7 of Paradise, that's really what it is, an enunciation of this whole theory in the terms of, for those of you who are Anselm, etc., then that implies that there must be some kind of general remaking of the world. That's what I think the idea. But nonetheless, this should not obscure the fact that there is a kind of apparent juxtaposition between the physical description of the world and the spiritual description of the world. There are two hemispheres, and yet they are connected. The spiritual, the creation, the experience of creation is really the way of positing a distinction or a difference into the universe, into the theory that the world is eternal. There are two conceptions that operative in the Middle Ages, and they are really represented by, one is by Aquinas, who is a theologian, but he's also a philosopher. And in fact, he could be called as the writer who wants to make a philosophical theology. He argues, he's known for the famous Summa, but he wrote a tract called Summa against the Gentiles, not the Summa of theology, but Summa contra Gentiles, where he argues that the eternity of the world, the theory of the eternity of the world, that there is no creation, he says, could be philosophically demonstrated. But it could also be philosophically repudiated. He says, philosophy can argue one side of it, and he goes on arguing that there is no way of thinking of, the usual questions: who created the creator? All these objections. It says, however, there is a theory, a view of creation, which is allowed, and it's possible on account of faith, but it also allows for the thought of freedom, origins, beginnings, etc. Bonaventure picks up some of these ideas. The ideas debated in Paris in the 13th century, around 1270, in Paris. Both of them are teachers at the university. Bonaventure says, no, this is untenable. The idea of the eternity of the world is absolutely untenable, because if the world were eternal, then we really would have no way of, no real succession of generations. There would be endless people who have been living before us. There's no evidence for this. Would be endless forms of, etc. He upholds the idea of creation. Dante intervenes into this debate and says that effectively the physical world and the spiritual world are really one continuous. They're one complementary to the other, and yet there is a difference between them. And the difference between them is the difference that he can find in Beatrice's speech. That little point of time, that little intrusion of time that distinguishes between one sound and another sound. But the spiritual universe originates in the world of nature as a natural production and reproduction, all of God's love, the physical world in exactly the same way. So there is a kind of symmetry. This is not Plato's inverted universe. The physical world is not Plato's inverted world. It's adjacent to it. It is as if Dante discovers that there are more dimensions to the world that we see than what medieval cosmologists or classical cosmologists had imagined. Interestingly enough, and I don't say this as a proof for any of what I've said at all, but there is a famous 19th century mathematician by the name of Riemann, a German mathematician. I don't know how many of you studied history of science. He's known, among other things, for having been the mathematics professor of Einstein. Well, he went on with a team of his students studying these cantos of the Divine Comedy to find evidence that, in fact, Dante had already a theory of fourth dimension, that there is the universe that we see, and then there's another universe. It is almost as if the folds of books, the folds of the parchments, are exactly giving an idea of, that's Riemann's, not me, an idea about what the actual structure of the universe may be. Having said this, don't forget to turn back to me my shell, the emblem of what I take. Very good, thank you. So let me see if there are some questions, because we can go on talking about some of these issues. Please.
I'm still not quite clear as to how the reference to Ulysses and Francesca in these cantos relate Beatrice's description of the universe and redemption back to Inferno, and how a redemption of the universe necessarily implicates, including Inferno as well as.
Excellent question, and I really welcome your skepticism. The question is about how exactly do the figures of Ulysses and Francesca shed light on what's happening here, and is it really tenable that Dante is implying that the sinners are going to be redeemed, saved, more or less? That's.
Yeah, and why they're brought up, how they fit into that explanation.
Good. I think that's a crucial issue. It's interesting that Dante should look at Ulysses and bring up the image of Ulysses in Canto 27. You find it interesting, and that, and Dante, one can say, Dante is really unlike Ulysses. Now he probably realizes how different he is from Ulysses, because Ulysses went to, he's implying how risky his own enterprise may be, which we have seen before. Ulysses was brought up in this journey in Canto with the meeting with the dream of the siren, was happening even before, and indirectly in some other cases, 26 in Canto 1 of Inferno even, and maybe we could just stop there as well. Dante's still, that's a kind of retrospective fascination. He's looking back and pinpointing that tragic moment, calls it the mad track of Ulysses. The madness implies that this man had violated the limits, all limits, including the limits of reason, okay? In his rational pursuit, philosophical investigation of the world, the scientific, he wants to go into an unpeopled world, to have experience. That's the key word for him. And yet, therefore, that madness implies that he had been delirious, had been going off the track. Okay, it says Dante, maybe that's for me too, but maybe not. Maybe I'm really a little safer now. I'm in the hands of Beatrice. She's guiding me. It's a way of trusting Beatrice. So we could say that is all true. And therefore, I could even see an element of relief on the part of Dante. We could even catch that. The relief is that his own adventure diminishes. The Greek epic hero, it really did very little. He just went beyond the pillars of Hercules. So we could stop there. It happens, though, that retrospectively, we can see the story of Ulysses as also the story of a metaphysician. Dante is in the heaven of metaphysics. In what way is he in the place of, what does metaphysics deal with? It deals with place, deals with time, And then we can understand why Ulysses, in Canto 26, he seems to be going from place to place. Place is the metaphor that distinguishes Ulysses. So then Dante says he's a failed metaphysician, but we understand that he really was going to the absolute. He really was trying to go where I'm going, and there is nothing else. We stop there. We go to Beatrice. Dante meets, is talking listening to Beatrice in Canto 29, and he's trying to figure out if it's possible to think of a beginning. How do things, if you have the eternity of forms and you have the eternity of matter, it's very difficult to know how you could really distinguish anything that goes before from what goes after. There is no such a thing as a before and an after. He tries to localize time. That's really the problem. And to localize time, he says that he really, Beatrice looked and reminded him of the point. It was a point of joy that overcame him. Maybe he's alluding, because the language is that of Francesca. So why Francesca? Let me just explain it at one point. Maybe he's alluding to a kiss, the two of them, that he remembers. It's, sort of very spiritualized, the context. Dante's never vulgar. Maybe he's just alluding to a kiss they had been exchanging to. Or maybe the will, the desire, the longing to have a kiss now, exchange a kiss with her. But one thing is clear, that he's thinking of Francesca as also a kind of metaphysician, because that's where we are. What is the metaphysics of Francesca? Metaphysics of desire, first of all, a desire that, what does it mean, the metaphysics of desire? Desire, by its own definition, is metaphysical in the sense that it's always moving beyond the objects it gains, because it burns up the various objects. Today I want this book, then I want another book, and then I want the car, and then I want the library, etc. That's the infinite movement of desire, which is what we call a metaphysics of desire. So she's a metaphysician. Not only she's a metaphysician, she lives in time. So she's a complementary figure to Ulysses. Ulysses is, you remember, I stopped at Ceuta, I left behind me Seville, and then etc., etc. Now, Francesca instead says, oh, how difficult it is to remember the joys of the past. I remember I was reading, that day I began reading, that day I stopped reading. Only a point was that overcame a point of time, a point of the book, etc. So maybe Dante is really saying, she too is another failed metaphysician. They would like to be where I am now, both Francesca and Ulysses. So we are bringing them to the place where Dante is. Now they are looking for the same thing he's having now, a conjunction of time and eternity, space and time, ubi and quando, to see the point where all things cohere. That's exactly where he's looking. How do I make things cohere? Of course, it's possible to think, one way of thinking of paradise and the joy of the blessed is to go on thinking that my joy, suppose that I were saved, a very unlikely proposition, my joy, it's possible to argue, is increased by, it's sadistic, the view of those who are suffering. Say, mercifully, I'm saved. That, to me, it's a most improbable form of beatitude, but it's likely that, seeing someone downtrodden and punished like that, could be that Dante saying, how lucky I am that I'm neither like Ulysses nor like really Francesca. I don't think that that's Dante, though. He's talking about cosmology and creation, the order of everything, how this order is an order of love, and how he is coming to know this order of love, because now knowledge is love, and love is knowledge. I think that by the allusion to them, he's also saying that here on earth, you can grant me that. That's what I said before, and I think that I'm not pushing it to the point of unbelievability. The whole argument becomes unbelievable. I can stay here and say, well, now what he's really saying is that I am here and I see how all things go here, but I know that sinful people on earth, those of us who live in the shadows of time, this tree, and we are under the leaves of time, then I know that in a sinful way, They were trying to do and know what I now have come to do and know. So I could stop here and say, well, we're all happy. There's no argument. I think that that makes logical sense. I can push it to the level, to the point of absurdity, to say, look, maybe if this is true, he's also saying not only that they, in a shadowy way, in a dim way, were anticipating the real happiness in the sinful modes, the sinners, but that maybe they too, if you move out of this text, this is not said in the text, that they too are going to be taken and placed into the bosom of Abraham, where all the blessed dwell. Maybe too, this is it my wishful thinking? I grant you, it's probably wishful thinking, but I do have the theology of redemption behind me that stands as uttered by Dante in Canto 7 of Paradise. I restated the whole thing in 2 minutes. That's not bad. Thank you. Other questions before we go back to, please.
Comment on the presence of Francesca also in light of the sexual language that comes afterwards.
Yes, thank you. Can I comment about Francesca in the fact that the creation is given in sexual terms? That this is love that opens itself, opens itself to new loves and so on. I cannot help but play a little bit of an etymological game too, by the way, because this is the world of origins, and I don't want to lose you. I mean, I know there is only one class, but I don't want to lose you. Of course, the way in which Dante is conveying all these senses is by playing with etymologies, because etymology is the science of the origin of words. So let me give you only one. I corrected my good friend St. Clair, inseparable from me. I mean, I'm never going to betray him, but I have to correct him occasionally, because he says revealed. That's what he means. He says the eternal love revealed itself in new love. He's missing the whole sexual language, which is exactly the reason. Thank you. It's exactly the reason why I think that Francesca too, who can arguably be saved. That's exactly the reason. The term he uses is aperse, from the Italian. In Italian we call it aprire, very close to, in English we have the word April, by the way, as an opening of the spring. Just to give you a sense of etymology, it comes from aperire, Latin, which really means to generate, to bring to light. As a woman brings a birth to light and life. That's really the word. That's the meaning of the word. So it's as sexual and as productive as it can be. Before I go back, though, to your question about how is that going to be, what Dante is saying, that creation is this sexual process, a sexual experience, which is exactly what Francesca also did. Breaking the law, undoubtedly, but she is in hell. Is she going to be in hell? Are we going to understand that there is a possible continuity between what she did in a physical sense and what Dante is doing in a spiritual sense? But this is the whole point of the discussion on cosmology and creation, that there is some kind of continuity between the two modes. Not quite the same thing. Of course, creation is a different order of experience. There is a thin, very thin line. It's like a little breath that Francesca can release as she, or Beatrice, who goes on talking endlessly. Yet she too that's the difference between the two. So between the language of sexuality, of physicality in Inferno, and the language of spirituality here in Paradise, there is a continuum between them, and there is a little difference, but there is also a possibility of a continuity. That's really exactly the argument that I would make about that. Let me, though, tell you more in a historical way, and a historical, so that if you don't agree with what I said, so be it. Don't worry. I don't agree with it completely on my own, but I think that that's a radical reading of the notion of cosmology and creation in Dante. Let me tell you something else historically. Where is Dante taking these ideas from? Whenever you read commentaries on Dante, and I hope that some of you will go on reading, and reading also scholars, thank you, critics. I see that nodding. It just, my heart just gladdens when I see that. And they all tell you, and I indicated that too, that, you know, that Dante is some kind of Aristotelian. And I was talking about metaphysics, how Aristotle calls it first philosophy, and Aristotelian terms. They never tell you what the actual sources of Dante are. The sources of Dante about cosmology and cosmography are really Neoplatonic. The idea of creation, so especially one text that I have to mention. This guy who writes the Cosmographia, called a 12th century man, Bernard Sylvester, a Frenchman, Bernard Sylvester, who writes Cosmographia, 12th century, known as the author of the School of Chartres. By the way, these texts were available to Dante. We have a text of this man, Cosmographia, one copy only, because a Florentine later, means he had it in Florence, by the name of Boccaccio, some of you know very well, he copied it down and transmitted it to us. We know his handwriting because we have his text, so we know. This is 1340. Dante, of course, wrote about 1302, but clearly that text was available there. In this text, Bernard gives an idea of creation and cosmological ideas, physical ideas. They had been reading the Timaeus in France, and they were always surprised and wondering, what is the difference? How can we go on having Plato say one thing about creation and Genesis saying something else? How are we going to connect these two forms, these two sources of tradition and authority? And they argue. What he goes on talks about the idea of a pre-existing world of matter, the natural world, and a malignant materiality, and how this malignant materiality is subdued into shape, and the subduing into shape is always sexual language. Natura is that which produces, generates. This is the text that I believe stands behind Dante's physical explanation of a universe, which is physical, but at the same time it is not just physical. There's also a theory of creation, and it's the theory of creation that has unpredictable possibilities. It tells you that things can be renewed if you stay within the bounds. You see how he criticizes the physical conception of the world. If you stay within those boundaries, you can't expect anything other than what you already have. You cannot expect any more evil or any less evil than what you already experience. The only idea, the way in which human beings can think about renewal, can think about change or freedom or origins, is only within the context of creation. That's exactly Dante's argument. And that's the profound justification for the distinction between one order of experience and a different order of experience. But if this is true, and it is true for Dante, then I have to take also seriously this idea of this central event of redemption, which now we understand what he takes that to be. The moment, the experience of the incarnation. This is exactly, it follows. If he believes that there is such a thing as, and he does, creation, then he has to believe that there is also the idea of a recreation, a second creation. Because the first creation clearly didn't work out all that well. So there is this other possibility. Please.
I have the sense that in these lines at the beginning of 29 that we've been talking about, that Dante is very aware of being on theological thin ice or skating close to the danger line. the idea is that divine love spills over out into a created world, so that it can be reflected back and adored and loved in return in the way that Paolo and Francesca loved each other reciprocally. That's not far from the thought that before creation, God has everything, but is still a little lonely. And that suggests a kind of imperfection, or at least incompleteness. But how can God be incomplete? And so Dante begins this passage by saying, not to acquire new goodness for himself. This is in my
Yes.
translation, which cannot be.
It was perfect.
Because that he wants to announce before he offers his Neoplatonic vision of the relationship of the Godhead to creation. He wants to signal his orthodoxy to doubters who might hear in this something which is less than perfectly Christian, because it comes close to the idea of a needy God, or a God who, in the way that every lover needs something and other to love in return, is in a predicament. And creation is the solution to the predicament that God is in before the world is made.
Okay, the question is well, actually, the question is more of a comment by the maestro here. The comment is that Dante, at the beginning of Canto 29, seems to be on theologically risky, on thin ice. I'm quoting thin ice, because the notion of a God who that Dante is really trying to save his skin, as it were, by claiming a kind of theological orthodoxy, when he actually knows that the very notion of creation, whereby God opens up into new loves, it seems to imply that before creation, God was a lonely guy looking for a partner, some kind of Adam in the garden replaces all that. That's really the question. I think that's a very interesting idea, of course, but I have to I will respond this not entirely in a funny way, but I hope it will come out as funny. It's really the question that St. Augustine asks in the Confessions. You know, there are always those people who wonder, because that's really what the question is. What did God do before creation? And St. Augustine responds, he was busy preparing hell to people like you who ask this kind of questions. And that's it. But the most seriously, the idea is that indeed creation implies, I mean, that's a response that I would offer. Creation implies a beginning, but this creation has been going on forever, and that the idea of the Trinitarian God is really a response to this problem you have. You obviously, I think, it's not obvious, but to me it's not obvious, I think that you are appealing to a different theological paradigm of where the unity of God can be the loneliness of God. The Christian reading of that unity is that it's always a productive, an internal life of love that always goes on producing itself and producing itself. On that note of theological grandeur, I thank you, and I say thank you. We'll see you. Have a good Thanksgiving.